Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In this new series, we're going to be looking at some great ideas that have shaped mankind and some of the personalities that have played such an important role in the development of our civilizations. Today, we're going to talk about the development of language and writing. This is such an important area for us to understand our origins and humanity's development. The origin of human language will perhaps remain obscure for a long time. By contrast, the origin of individual languages has been the subject of very precise study over the past 2 centuries. There are about 5,000 languages spoken in the world today, a third of them in Africa, but scholars group them together into relatively few families, probably less than 20. In today's panel, I'm joined by Amjad Hussain and Arif Ahmad Saab, our panelists who have contributed so wisely to our previous programs. Welcome.
Thank you.
Before we start on the program on language development and writing, I just want to give a little bit of background because a lot of this is related to how humanity has migrated across our planet. And it's interesting when you go on holidays and you see people with different colors, different backgrounds, and the languages, and you wonder how these are interlinked. So most people, I think, Amjad, you'll agree, feel that humanity shares its origins from Africa. And the current view is that about 150,000 years ago, humanity, current Homo sapiens as we are currently known, migrated out of Africa into the Middle East, Arabia, the sort of Syria, Palestine area. And around 72,000 years ago, the migration from there really went out to different parts of the world. Some of humanity went towards the Indian subcontinent and some towards the European continent. And it's thought around 40 to 50,000 years ago, people started migrating towards Europe and also towards India. And then from India, they started migrating towards the South Asian islands and eventually to Australia. And interestingly, some brave members of humanity also persisted with the cold across Siberia and to the Bering Straits, which connects Siberia to Alaska. And they crossed the Bering Straits around 15,000 years ago to populate the Americas from Canada downwards towards South America. So really the last migration probably was towards South America around 12,500 years ago. So this really gives you a picture of how humanity started off from Africa and spread to all the different parts of the world. The question is, how did language develop in humanities? I'm going to start off with Amjad. Now, traditionally, many of us have been told through our religious education classes and our religious groups as well of how humanity developed. And tell us the Islamic angle first, and then I'll touch on a little bit with Arif as well.
Well, thank you, Dasab. And I just want to make one thing clear from the outset, and as you quite rightly highlighted, that at the moment there is no consensus among scholars as to the age and origin of the human language itself. There is, of course, a lot of conjecture, hypotheses, and theories that have been put forward as to how, why, where the languages and writing came from. And from a religious point of view, we find that Adam, thus mankind, had at the point of creation the ability of speech and endowed with knowledge. We find, for instance, in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 32 to 34, that, for instance, that the Lord Almighty had taught Adam all the names, thus knowledge. Then he put the objects of these names before the angels and said, "Tell me the names of these if you are right." They said, "Holy art thou, no knowledge have we except what thou hast taught us. Surely thou art all-knowing and wise." And then the Lord said to Adam, tell them their names. And when he had told them their names, the Lord turned to angels and said, "Did I not say to you, I know the secrets of the heavens and the earth, and I know what you reveal and what you hide." And we also find in Surah Al-Alaq, chapter 96, verse 5 and 6, that God Almighty had taught man by the pen, taught man what he knew not. So these are good examples, these are generic examples of from the creation point of view, how man was bestowed with knowledge and writing. It does not, Quran and the scriptures are not books of history, so they don't definitively tell us time, where, and when that happened, except that these things happen in the Garden of Eden.
But it's interesting in the way that there's no specific date, time there, but just a process of how it happened. Arif, obviously, in the Western world, a lot of our views were formed from biblical teachings up till the recent scientific revolution. And from a biblical point of view, I mean, Adam was supposed to have been created in around 6,000 years ago. Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable how similar the quotes that I'm going to read from the Bible mirror what Amjad has just talked about from the Islamic perspective. If I just give you one very simple quote, this is in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1, and it reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." If you look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 19, "And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he could call them. And whatsoever called every living creature, that was the name thereof." So you can see here there's a very, very strong emphasis on God being the creator of everything, God giving all of this information and passing on this knowledge to Adam, who Christians and many other cultures believe to be the first man, and that's where the inception or the beginning of language started, because obviously he had to communicate. But there's also one other point which ties in with what you were talking there about spreading out. And again, this is mentioned in Genesis chapter 11, verses 7 to 9. And if I just read the whole quote, "And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they all have one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel." And I'm sure a lot of us will remember when we were studying the Tower of Babel, and this word is obviously still used today. But this ties in with sort of saying that maybe there was, according to the Christian tradition, one language initially, and as people migrated, as people developed, as arguments started, as splits came about, the languages split and people started speaking different languages. So it's a theory. Whether it's credible or discredible is a matter for discussion. But it shows that the background to this is that God taught people how to speak, and he allowed them to develop different languages.
The common theme clearly between the Abrahamic traditions in particular, and there are other religions that have used, is that God, the creator, taught mankind as well. The only thing is the scientists and the religious theologians have this clash of, was it 6,000 years ago when God created Adam specifically, in a way, and the scientific view that humanity, mankind, like everything else, biologically and otherwise, has developed, evolved over time as well. This is a history program, but I just wanted to really let listeners know that many of us, many people certainly, have been influenced by religious views, but there's lots of different sorts of religious interpretations of how God created, when, etc. And we're going to try to cover some of that. But because it's a history program, I want us to focus on some of the historical analysis, documents, and prehistoric archaeological records, etc. So if we go back, Amjad, to the sort of story I painted of how humanity migrated from before 150,000 years ago, we'll leave that bit because clearly there were early developments of how humanity came to that form. But the development of language in early man, you described obviously the Quranic point of view, but let's look at it from a historical, scientific point of view. It must have been a big step for early mankind, early Homo sapiens, to really start learning to communicate through language. Take us through, because, communication is common to bees, to birds, to apes, and lots of other animals as well. But human beings are very specific in their communication. Just share with us a little bit of that.
Absolutely. Now turning back to the science again, of course, numerous, over a period of time, numerous linguists, archaeologists, psychologists, anthropologists, for instance, and others have tried to tackle this fundamental problem of, where and where and why language came about, and they're using new tools that are analytical tools that are now available to science and sociology, and new methodologies to consider all these aspects. And of course, it is still a very puzzling and one of the hardest enigmas in human evolution, and of course in modern science. And a number of theories are proposed. Some of the early ones are that basically. We cannot doubt that language owes its origin to the imitation and modifications aided by early humans and their signs, symbols, gestures, and their natural surroundings, the voices they heard of other animals, and man's own instinctive cries, for instance. And that was basically the opinion of Charles Darwin in his The Descent of Man. Many other scholars since that time have cited similar theories to postulate as to where language actually originated. And for instance, there is a Popo theory that first the man basically expressed his emotional interjections which were triggered by pain, pleasure, and surprises. And there's another theory which states that things that obviously the sort of man lived in a particular environment in the African savannah you mentioned earlier on, and he would hear these vibrating natural sounds, and he would mimic, for instance, the voices of the animals, the cries of the animals, and so on. But of course, over time, the scientists think that these early theories are a bit childish and so on, and they want to use what is now available to geneticists and human biology and evolution and cognition to put forward more relevant theories. So we come basically to the 20th century where Chomsky and others linguists have been particular in this field.
Arif, your thoughts on some of the titles of, how these...
I would urge our listeners to look at some of these theories, because the names of them themselves tell you how much people think about them. So, for example, we've got the Bow Wow theory. Yeah. And actually, probably this one people can maybe relate to. This is what's saying that language has been an imitation of natural sounds. So maybe, for example, where you hear a cow going moo, or a cat going meow, or I remember if you look at comic books and they would be fighting and you would see pow and wow and crash. Now, is it that people heard these and somehow they mimic these sounds and they develop them into words and into language? It's a possibility. It's a little bit far-fetched, in my opinion, as to how full languages could develop from that. And another one is that I found very funny was the La theory. So this is one based on that any single factor, there was no single factor based on to initiate human language, and it would be more like a romantic side of human life. So I'm not sure how the romantic side would develop into language. But there's a whole range of theories, and as Amjad was saying, none of them are really very, very credible. I think what scientists want to try and do is they like to be analytical. They like to be empirical data as to how language is. And it's very difficult, because how do you go back thousands, if not millions of years and say, how did the first word start? It's very, very difficult to quantify or to measure that.
Amjad, you're a scientist by background, and I was reading the other day, in some of the ape families, which are probably the closest to human beings, the way they're able to show about some food supply somewhere, or how it tastes, or some danger as well, because they're able to communicate these to their little tribes of chimps and the apes, aren't they, to avoid danger, or where there's ample fruit or something tasty as well. It's fascinating.
Well, biologists have done some fascinating studies of late, and of course anthropologists and human biologists have done various experiments both in the laboratory as well as in the environment. And so two possible scenarios are proposed for the development of language. And they are basically, one of them is that they support gestural theory. And the gestural theory is that language developed from the calls of our ancestors. And also that language was derived from gestures. And the first perspective that language evolved from the calls of our ancestors seems logical because both humans and animals make sounds and cries. One evolutionary reason to refute this is that, of course, there is anatomical, the center that controls the cells in monkeys and other animals is located in a completely different part of the brain than it is humans. In monkeys, the center is located in the depth of the brain, and that relates to emotions. In human system, it is located located in an area unrelated to emotions. Humans can communicate simple to communicate without emotions, but our ancestors started to use more and more tools as well. So basically, there is a theory that that interlinks that, meaning that the hands were occupied and they could no longer be used for gesturing. There are manual gesturings require that speech and listener be visible to each other.
Sorry, just to interrupt there. I mean, I think also the environment in which people are growing up. So if you were, for example, in a very hot climate or in a very cold climate, that would also affect your ability to work, how you would, maybe in a very cold environment, you were using more gestures because it was difficult to speak. So as people had spread throughout the world, the environmental factors and where they were living, no doubt would have had an impact on how their language would be developing as well.
You're listening to Voice of Islam. I'm your host, Dr. Mohammed Iqbal, and I'm joined by my panelists, Amjad, Hussain and Arif Ahmad. Today we're talking about the development of language and writing. So, Amjad, the other interesting thing is that, mankind or human beings had a very specific development, both in their brain and their vocal cords as well, as a result of which they could really refine their... do you want to share with us a little bit of insight?
Well, the theory is the out of Africa theory that you basically outline in the beginning of your program, basically postulates that when man moved from trees to living in the savannah, and he discovered fire, and thus he was able to cook meat, and meat is basically good protein source, and fish. So basically the consumption of fish and these oils, particularly the omegas 3, 6 and 9 as they are called now, more amino acids intake, and that basically developed our cognitive, enhanced our cognitive abilities, and also our voice box that gradually evolved what is called the verbal language from the sign language, and it of course depended on this neural structure. And we find that basically that patients who are impaired use sign language suffer from a left hemisphere lesion, show that the same showed this same disorder with the sign language as vocal patients did with their oral language, and of course other research has also found that the same left hemisphere brain regions were active during sign language as during the use of vocal or written language. So the primary gesture is at least partially genetic. Different non-human apes will perform gestures that are characteristic of their species, even if they've never seen another ape perform that gesture. For example, gorillas beat their chest, as is well known. This shows that gestures are an intrinsic and important part of primate communication, which supports the idea that language actually evolved from gesture.
One of the interesting things is a lot of scientific work has been done now on the development of language and some of the skills that modern humans have. And a lot of that is related to the size of the brain, the cranium, etc. So you had some of the early fossil records of beings that are related to early humans, Australopithecus, probably around 4 million years ago. And the brain capacity increased roughly from 500 cc's to around 1500 cc's for modern human beings. And it just goes to show how important that brain development was. And as Amjad has mentioned, both the way the brain was structured and the vocal cords were developed. So Arif, I'm going to move to you now. Clearly, I explained how humanity has migrated out of Africa. But there came a stage around 40,000 years ago when they started expressing things around them, then the cave paintings. Tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, cave painting is very, very interesting because the good thing about that is that there are obviously paintings all around the world. And this is something that can be studied. And obviously this was created by somebody who was living 40,000 years ago. There's even some argument that cave painting started 60,000 years ago. the things which is quite surprising is that wherever these cave paintings were in the world, they're all very similar. There are the common themes of animals being in them. Humans are usually depicted as with a sort of a stencil of a hand. And they're used in lots of different ways. Sometimes they could be just used as mere decoration. You know, you're living in a cave and you want to decorate the cave. That's one way of doing it. But more often than not, they're actually a method of communication. Now, whether that's communicating the people in the local area, whether it's a message for people in the future, again, this is, still not fully understood, the purpose behind these. But it does show some intelligence, and it does show some care that the people were trying to communicate in different ways. And they were also trying to represent what was important to them at that point in time. So the reason presumably why the animals appear so much, because obviously if you had animals, you could prosper, you could thrive, you had food, you could farm your land. And so obviously animals were given great significance in these. And I was even reading the other day about how some cave art has now been described as cave graffiti. So, there was even maybe a recreational purpose to what this is. And it shows that, as you mentioned, that as the human brain developed and got bigger, people were expressing themselves, leaving messages, and we're using this as a form of enjoyment and entertainment and art. So I think there's still a long way to go in understanding what cave paintings fully represent.
And clearly a very important development, because for the first time we're able to see around the world, as Arif has said, expressions of the environment they were living in. Your own thoughts and...
that's self-explanatory. People lived in a particular surrounding. They experienced the environment, the change of the seasons. They observed the cosmos, and of course their surroundings, and they wanted to express that in form of symbolic art, as it were. And then, of course, at that time, as they were, eating more fish, denaturing proteins, and they had fire. They were able to develop their more cognitive abilities, and they wanted to express themselves in a spiritual form. So they, now we 40 to 60,000 years, that was the thing. And then obviously as they evolved, they wanted to express themselves more symbolically. They constructed these megalithic sites, for instance, what the archaeologists have found recently in an archaeological site called Göbekli Tepe. And the archaeologists think that this dates back to 11,000 BC and was used as a potential spiritual center. It has anthropomorphic figures. Some archaeologists think that they were the primitive zodiac. Now we have the present houses, the 12 signs of the zodiacs, but obviously the man then, this present zodiac we have is basically either Sumerian or Egyptian that we inherited. But before that, this primitive man that lived around 11,000 BC, he had his own particular zodiac, and the signs would have been different. For instance, there are vultures on it, and there are anthropomorphic figures such as amphibians and so on, lizards and so forth. And they would use this symbology. They put these blocks, similar, not too dissimilar to stone, what we have Stonehenge here in Wiltshire.
So it's interesting the way you've described the development, or the way we've sort of talked about it. Over time, mankind started to develop themselves as social beings more and more so around the great rivers of the world, in terms of small tribes, villages, etc., leading up to some of the cities. And that takes me to the phase of how mankind then started expressing their ideas more so than just these paintings, etc., and the first form of writing. So, Amjad, do you want to start?
There is basically, it is generally agreed that true writing of language was independently conceived and developed in at least two ancient civilizations, and possibly more. The two places where it is more certain that the concept of writing was both conceived and developed independently are in Sumer, in ancient Mesopotamia, around the region what we call today Iraq, between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, around 3,500 BC, and in Mesoamerica around 300 BC. And because no precursor have been found to either of these respective regions. Several Meso-American scripts are known, but the oldest being the Olmec, of course, in America. In the Latin America. However, independent writing systems also arose in Egypt around 3000 BC, as well as in China around 1200 BC, and then we move on to what is known as the Proto-Sanskrit or the Proto-Indo-European scripts in the Indus Valley.
This is probably a good place to have a break, so we'll carry on after the break. You're listening to the Voice of Islam Living History program. Today we're discussing the development of language and writing. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back. I'm your host, Dr. Mohammed Iqbal. You're listening to the Voice of Islam Living History program. Today we've been talking about the development of language and writing with my panelists, Amjad, Hussain and Arif Ahmad. In the first part of the program, we looked at really how language originated, how humanity migrated throughout the world, and how early language developed. And we look at how mankind differs in its communication from other animals and other forms of communication. And we were really looking at how humanity became organized in the major river civilizations and the great cities. And the earliest really known form of writing that we're aware of was in Mesopotamia or Sumeria, current Iraq. And Amjad, you were just saying how that language developed. Explain to us how they shaped this language and what some of it actually meant. It'd be fascinating.
Well, the languages evolved from symbolism into writing in the peculiar way as we outlined in our previous program, and of course, mankind wanted to express themselves in one way or another, and also, when they moved from a primordial situation to more cultivating culture, from hunter-gatherers to cultivation, they wanted to count things. They wanted to count their sheep, they wanted to count their cattle and so on, and they also wanted to document stuff, the seasons and so on, the heavens, for instance. Numerology, at the moment, linguists think developed independently, but I think goes in together. There are other scholars who think it goes hand in hand with formal writing. So, for instance, you wanted to count things, we have, basically 10 fingers, including the thumb, if I include that as a finger as well. But then if you want to go to higher numbers, what you use is you use your knuckles on your left hand, and there are 12 knuckles, and you've got your 5 fingers, and you multiply 12 by 5, you get 60. And then, of course, there are 60s, what we have. Hence, these, we have 365 approximately days, 360 degrees in a circle. So this all comes from ancient Sumer, and the 12, that's where the 12 dozen also comes from. And we also find symbolically there are 12 tribes of Israel, and there are 12 sons of Ishmael, and so forth. So there is an obsession with 12. But again, it all works to hexadecimal, to 60. And we find that the circle has 360 degrees, and there are 12 houses in the zodiac, there are 12 symbolism. So symbolism, numerology, language, vocabulary is all interlinked. And you quite rightly said language predominantly developed in two main areas in the ancient. One is Mesopotamia.
And the other one, Arif, we were talking earlier on the Egyptians as well. That was around similar period to the Sumerians, and some say there's a linkage as well, perhaps.
Yeah, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. I suppose with Egypt, the most distinguishing feature is hieroglyphics. Which is basically...
And they're more familiar to people from all the movies and with all the bird shapes. And
if you watch things like Indiana Jones, you'll see how he manages to read the hieroglyphics. But the interesting thing is that this language was almost deliberately complicated because the people that wrote the language, the scribes, they were only from certain backgrounds and they were quite educated and they wanted to preserve their status. So although, you would think that language and writing, particularly writing, would be developed in a way that everybody could access it, sometimes it was about preserving status and preserving a person's importance, because if you were a scribe, you would always have work. So if you made the language complicated, it was difficult for other people to learn it. But yes, Egypt obviously is a very, very old language, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, with its predominant feature of hieroglyphics, pictures representing different things.
obviously there was the Indus civilizations, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, etc., and they had developed their own languages and forms of writing. And then, Amjad, you mentioned the Chinese around 1200 BC, they developed, but their writing is quite different to what we're familiar with. Do you want to share with us a little bit of how that developed? And whether it's totally different or whether there's a linkage with other languages?
Well, the linguist and the archaeologists think that the Chinese writing system developed independently, and they call it the logographic system, of the Middle Eastern basically culture. And it is thought that the first true alphabetic writing was developed around 2000 BC by the Semitics, some Semite workers in the Sinai, by giving mostly Egyptian hieroglyphs Semitic values. The Jez writing system of Ethiopia is considered Semitic. It is likely to be of semi-independent origin, having roots in basically in the Sudanese ideogrammic system. Most of the alphabets in the world today either descend from one of this innovation, maybe through the Venetian alphabet, or they're directly inspired by its design, the Sumerian design and so forth. Then we pass into the Greco-Roman system, which actually
those are later developments.
The later developments, of course.
So really, I want listeners to sort of get a view of. So you had obviously the symbolic languages and the forms of writing with the Sumerians and the Egyptians and maybe Indus Valley, etc. But I suppose the big move then towards a more constructive writing with the alphabetical sort of formation was through the Semitic tribes. That was probably about 3,000 years or so. And maybe, Arif, if you want to take us through, because a lot of the languages are linked to the Semitic tradition, which was picked on later on by the Phoenicians, and then, as you say, it moved to the Greeks, and then the Roman, etc. But just dealing
mainly
with
from Crete and then on to there is a Proto-Crete writing as well.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. This is where you can see a sort of a family or a branch of languages and writing developing. So from the Proto-Semitic branch, you've got Eastern and Western branches, then Southern and Northern, and this developed into Ethiopia, into Arabia, classic languages like Aramaic and Canaanite, and even directly leading to more modern Arabic dialects, and even in some of the African countries as well. So there's a whole lineage you can see of the Semitic languages, which some of these languages are still around to today.
I mean, it's interesting when we look at the world today. Probably numerically, the numbers of people where a language is spoken the more, Mandarin with the Chinese. But if you look across the world with a shared language, English is probably one of the most widely spoken languages. And interestingly, out of all the different families of languages, the Indo-European languages are by far the biggest number. Amjad, do you want to share with us a little bit about the linkages? I mean, it's amazing how the Indo-European languages have shaped much of Europe and certainly go across to India as well. And as I say, as a family of languages, they're probably the biggest number in the impact they've had on the world.
Well, of course, the Indo-European languages, as they are known, there are two roots to this in prehistory. One is that around the Zagros Mountains, when civilization developed, and people basically either moved northwards when the ice caps melted and land for cultivation became available, and the other things that people also moved into the Indian subcontinent, where the Proto-Indian script developed, known as the Proto-Indus script. Developed.
Sanskrit also originated from that link, didn't it?
Yes.
With Aryans from Central Europe coming across.
Yes, of course, from the Indus script developed the Sanskrit and the Middle Indian languages, and now today what we call Hindustani, Bengali, and other Indian languages. And then, of course, people that moved northwards and then we have the Germanic tribes that moved, from the Zigros and from the Caucasian mountains northwards, the Germanic tribes, and that gave rise to the Germanic languages. And then there is, of course, the Baltic and the Slavic languages also have their offshoot from the Indo-European, and the Albanian, the Celtics, for instance, and then we have the other subgroup, which is the Hellenic group, which gives rise to modern Latin, the Greco-Roman. So from the old Germanic languages, we have the Gothic and East Germanic and Western Germanic, and that basically the Western Germanic splits into High Germanic and Lower Germanic, and out of the Lower Germanic we have the Anglo-Saxon, which is at the time of Anglo-Saxon was known as the Old English, and then we have the Middle English giving rise to Modern English.
I suppose this is why it's such a big family, because the spread has been just massive.
Absolutely. I mean, just to contrast, if you think about something like Persian and Spanish, you wouldn't think that initially that they were from the same family of languages, and this is how prevalent and how spread out this language has become. Even something like Swedish and Latin, they're also from the same family of languages. So obviously this has taken a long time to develop, but the basic root is from the Indo-European family of languages. And although there are many thousands of languages, in terms of the sources or the roots of these languages, there's far less, because languages become developed over time. We talked about this in the earlier part of the program, how different factors, environmental factors and ecological factors have affected the development of language. And when you start to trace it, you realize that a lot of these modern day languages are all very, very connected.
I mean, one of the persons who's done a lot in terms of language and its development, both in terms of human origins and how the different languages are linked, is Chomsky, who was the father of really language theory.
Basically, in the from 1990s onward, this has been, languages are referred to as Chomskyan or pre-Chomskyan, basically. So he's been such a revolution in terms of linguistics, and he worked, of course, with computational linguists using computers, and he worked with a computer scientist called Robert Berwick, and of course they also interlinked with modern biology, cognition, and neurosciences as well. So they brought basically all the tools that are available from social sciences as well as from biology, from evolutionary biology, molecular biology, from neurosciences, and they put them all together, and using modern computational techniques, they figured out that languages have basically common roots, all languages. So they basically group languages now into Semitic and Indo-European. And of course, there are early African...
And then there's the Sino-Tibetan, which is the Chinese as a big family.
But what they're basically saying is that languages, just like humanity has a common source, so have languages and so forth. They have common roots. Say we find, for instance, English is modern English. What we have is a combination of everything. You find that there are Sanskrit words in it, and there are Greco-Roman words in it, and so forth. So it's basically a hybrid language that has evolved over a period of time, and it borrows heavily from all other languages. Say, for instance, going back to Persian is very much another Indo-European languages, although it's spoken in a different area of the world in modern-day Iran. But we find that Persian, for instance, is also interlaced with heavily with the ancient Elamite script. Say, for instance, just to mention the word, there is a language, independent language, what we call Urdu, which is a hybrid language. It's in part Sanskrit, Hindi, Farsi, Arabic, and Turkish. But for instance, even the word itself has an origin in ancient Elamite. Or for instance, there was, if we go back to Sumer, there was an ancient city called Eridu on the banks of the river Euphrates. And Eridu, the city, meant of the camp of the gods initially. Now we know that through different languages, this word found itself in the Elamite language, Elamite script, into the Indo-European script, and then into the Turkish script, and subsequently finds its way into Farsi and modern-day Urdu, basically, which came derived from the Turkish, because the Mongols that came, they were Turkish, Persian, and Mongolian tribes, and they used the word to describe the camp or the encampment of the army as Urdu, which meant the camp of the army, dating back to, of course, this links to the ancient city of the gods, of the camp of the gods, which was the ancient city of Eridu. So how, the wordplay on there, slightly different, letters are used, U, R, D, U, and Eridu, E, D, R, U, but it signifies the same thing, camp.
You're listening to the Voice of Islam Living History program. I'm your host, Dr. Mohammed Iqbal, with my panelists, Amjad, Hussain and Arif Ahmad. Today we are talking about the development of language and writing. So, yeah, it was interesting what you mentioned there. I mean, when we look at our country or island of Britain or England as well, it's fascinating, Arif, isn't it? The original language used to be, when you listen to Welsh, it is so different to others in England and Scotland speak as well.
Absolutely. I mean, these Gaelic languages, I suppose, is what people would commonly call them. They sound very different, and the expressions and the parts of your voice box you use sounds very, very different. But there is a common connection. Obviously, geographically, they're not very, very far apart. But it shows that language is developing. People think that now that we've got all these languages, they're not changing. Some are dying out. Some new ones are being developed. And also, what you also find, which I find very interesting, is that new words are being created all the time. So language is just like humans are developing and evolving and hopefully going on to greater things. Languages is also developing. It's not something that's sort of set in stone or set in time. New words, new phrases, new ways of speaking are coming in all the time. I mean, and one way of looking at this is that if you look at, for example, something like William Shakespeare, the writing of William Shakespeare, although he was a great wordsmith and one of the best, literary writers of all time, the language that he uses, although it's English, is very different from how you would write English now. So people should, think and bear in mind that language will continually develop. I'm sure it will be very different in 50 years' time.
It's interesting when we sort of think about language and linkages, over the many years, there's been lots of controversy. But you can see, as you've mentioned, that there is an evolution of language, as there has been, I suppose, of biological evolution in different ways. And the question is, who controls and which bit dominates and which survives and which moves on? And languages have interestingly shown a similar sort of thing. But I suppose one of the things that was really interesting for me as a Muslim living in the West is to look at my own faith and the Holy Book, etc., and look at Arabic and its origins and what goes on. And interesting, the founder of the Ahmadi community had written quite a bit on the development of language. And early on, he said that Arabic was the mother of all languages. Arif, do you want to, because there's some recent scientific research as well, which has shown some interesting linkages as well.
I think just to explain the context of this, the founder of the Ahmadi Muslim community, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, he basically used this as a way of refuting a claim of Max Muller about languages. And he wrote a book called Minanur Rehman, which is basically his philosophy and his investigation into how Arabic is the mother of all languages. Now, it's obviously a bold claim, but it's not just based on his own views. It's based on, analysis of the Arabic language, and detailed study of that language to show how Arabic is a very, very rich language, how it has many different meanings, how small words, so for example, different letters signify simple things. Anybody who's a Muslim will recognize that when you say Alif Lam Mim, that this doesn't just mean, I think it means, literal meaning is I am Allah the All-Knowing. This is one of the beginnings of, I think it's Surah Al-Baqarah. So it's a very, very rich language, and it's basically set out that all languages developed from there. And this takes us back to what we were talking about. Did languages develop spontaneously without any guidance, or was Arabic the language from which other languages developed? Now, of course, very difficult to prove it either way, but this is another perspective which I think our viewers, our listeners should be aware of.
It was interesting when Amjad started and you gave the quote from the Holy Quran about God Almighty speaking and how language developed. And I was reading recently in relation to language and its development. It was interesting. There's a chap called Quentin Atkinson from the University of Auckland who wrote a paper in the Science magazine. And what he seems to say is that in his work, they've been able to retrace the world's 6,000 languages from English to Mandarin back to a single mother tongue. So it's interesting, isn't it? God Almighty clearly has taken humanity through different shapes, forms, and development. But ultimately, God Almighty also from our religious point of view, and you and I are scientists as well, so there's got to be a level of logic in our thinking as well. You know, how when humanity, as I mentioned at the start, when they had migrated out of Africa through Middle East, obviously Arabia, a lot of Israel, the Semitic traditions and development as well. So I don't know if you want to share some thoughts on
Absolutely.
that.
Well, I mean, going back to the scripture again, like you mentioned that how the holy founder of the Ahmadiyya movement also reiterates that there is a universal language, and the root of that is the Arabic. And God says that the Quran, before the Quran was revealed to Mohammed, it was preserved as a tablet in heaven known as Lohe Mahfuz. And we also hear it from the Indian tradition quite independently. They say that the Vedas, of course, again, Muslims believe that there is no community to whom the Lord has not sent guidance. So obviously, and there is a concept of people of the book, not just Judo-Christian and Abrahamic faiths, but this basically speaks of all humanity, that humanity has been endowed with knowledge, and not just knowledge at the inception of creation, but also guidance, periodically guidance if they went astray. So basically all mankind, but however, obviously, they'll use their own language and symbolism to express meaning of higher spirituality and wisdom. And we find that in the Sanskrit tradition, and we find that in the Vedic tradition, more to say, there is saying that all this repository of knowledge came from what is known as the Akashic records, which are held in Akash, i.e. in heaven. So basically, it signifies and supports the idea that there is a heavenly, because there is also an assertion by the writers of the Vedas that no non-Sanskrit speaker can understand Sanskrit because it is the language of the gods. So we find convergence of Sanskrit, and I mentioned the word Urdu, for instance, which is Indo-European, but going back in time and space, I know linked it to 3000 BC with the Proto-Elamite and also with the ancient city called Eridu. So here we find that humanity has common origins, and also languages have common origins, and perhaps revealed wisdom and knowledge, when we say ascends from above, also has a common origin.
I think that's a good point to probably stop, and maybe for our listeners, for me to just summarize what we've discussed. But before I do that, just some additional information from the scientists from New Zealand, Professor Atkinson. He says that the distinct sounds or phonemes, consonants, vowels, and tones in 504 world languages, finding and is found compelling evidence that they can be traced back to long forgotten dialects spoken by our Stone Age ancestors in the paper. And it also says that as the people migrated from Africa out towards the different regions, the number of click using languages, which are more common in Africa, decreased over time, and where they use something like 100 phonemes or sounds in Africa, there's only about 13 used in Hawaii. So as you move on, it changes, and that's how they found the linkages. So I think it's been quite a fascinating discussion that we've had. We've tried to look at the religious origins of language as well as what is currently known by our scientists and historians of how languages have evolved, and they'll continue to evolve. And who knows, one day when we are part of the Star Trekky generations, what our common languages will be. But they've certainly helped us shape things on our planet Earth and amongst our different civilizations as well. So I hope that we will continue to shape our understanding of humanity and language development. I would like to request our listeners that if they could give us some feedback, it would be greatly appreciated. Our Twitter handle is at VI Living History. So please do let us know what you think of our programs. We've got many interesting programs to cover over the next few weeks and months. So to my panelists, Amjad and Arif, thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. Until our next program, Assalamu alaikum.